Hello, welcome to our topic about cerebrovascular accident, or also known as stroke, and traumatic brain injury. So first, let's talk about the anatomy of the brain. First is its origin. Your forebrain, or also known as your prosencephalon, is divided to two parts. You have your telencephalon, which is also known as your cerebral hemisphere, or cerebrum. Your diencephalon, or also known as your thalami. Then the midbrain, or also known as mesencephalon. The hindbrain, or also known as the rhombencephalon, is divided to two parts. The metencephalon, which later on becomes the pons and the cerebellum, and the myelencephalon, which later on becomes the medulla oblongata. So here's the picture of the brain. Our cerebral hemisphere, or also known as the cerebrum, is divided to four lobes. You have your frontal lobe, which is responsible for the speech, motor, and behavior. The parietal lobe, which is responsible for the overall sensory and perceptual function. The temporal lobe, which is responsible for the auditory and comprehension. And lastly, the occipital lobe, which is responsible for our vision. Next, let's talk about the fissures or depressions on the cerebrum. So there are four main fissures. You have your longitudinal fissure, which divides the two cerebral hemispheres. The Rolandic fissure, which divides the frontal and parietal lobe. Your lateral fissure of Sylvius, which divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe. Then you have your calcarine fissure, together with parieto-occipital fissure, which divides the temporoparietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So here's the picture. This is the Rolandic fissure. This is the Sylvian fissure. If you cut the brain in half in sagittal plane, you will see the parieto-occipital fissure and the calcarine fissure. Then the top view of the brain, you have your longitudinal fissure. Next, let's talk about the Brodmann areas. You have a total of 52 Brodmann areas, but let's focus more on the important areas only. So first, on the frontal lobe, you have your area 4, which is also known as the primary motor cortex, responsible for our motor movement. You have area 6, or also known as premotor cortex, or also known as the secondary association motor area, responsible for motor planning. Then you have your area 8, or also known as frontal eye field, responsible for the fast movement of the eye, or saccadic movement. And you have your area 44-45, or also known as the Broca's area. It is also known as the primary motor speech area, responsible for the response. You have your temporal lobe. In your temporal lobe, you have your area 22, or also known as your Wernicke's area. It is also known as your primary sensory speech area, responsible for our comprehension. You have area 41 and 42, or also known as the transverse gyrus of Herschel. Area 41 is the primary auditory cortex, and 42 is the auditory association area. Area 43 is also known as your gustatory center, responsible for the taste sensation. Area 39, or also known as the angular gyrus, responsible for language, number processing, and spatial cognition. Once affected by stroke, the disease or the disorder is your Gertzmann syndrome. Occipital lobe. You have your area 17 or the calcarine area. It is also known as your primary visual cortex. Area 18 and 19. That is your visual association area or your secondary visual area, responsible for the slow movement of the eye. Then area 40 or your supramarginal gyrus. It is your sensory motor collaborator and integrator. Once affected in stroke, you have the manifestation of agnosia and apraxia. Last on the cerebral hemisphere is your parietal lobe. You have area 3, 1, 2, or the primary sensory area. Then area 5, 7, or the secondary sensory area, or your sensory association area. Let's go now to the diencephalon or the thalami. First part is your subthalamus. Its main function is for movement coordination. Its functional nuclei is located at the basal ganglia. You have epithalamus. Your epithalamus has two parts. You have your habenula, which is responsible for visceral function, and your pineal body, which releases melatonin, responsible for sleeping. Next is the hypothalamus. Its function, first, it regulates the sleep-wake cycle or circadian rhythm. Next, it regulates the pituitary gland, responsible for hormonal release. It also regulates the autonomic nervous system. It regulates the core body temperature, and it also regulates satiety and hunger. And then lastly, the thalamus, or the sensory relay center. It receives almost all sensory impulses. Let's go down to the brainstem. First is your midbrain. Your midbrain has the red nucleus, which is responsible for the unconscious muscle coordination. It is where your rubrospinal tract originates. Its functional nuclei is located on the basal ganglia. Next, you have your tegmentum and tectum of the midbrain, which is responsible for the body-eye reflex. In your midbrain, you have some reflexes that persist forever, and those are your writing reflexes. Example of that is your neck on body, body on head, body on body, optic writing reaction, labyrinthine writing reaction, and protective extension reflex, or also known as your parachute reflex. Next part of the brainstem is your pons. Your pons is responsible for your lateral gaze. It is the origin of your cranial nerve number 6, or your abducens nerve. The upper part of the pons is your pneumotaxic center, which inhibits inspiration. And the lower part of the pons is your apneustic center, which inhibits the pneumotaxic center. Part of the metencephalon is your cerebellum. The cerebellum has 3 main lobes. The neocerebellum, or also known as the posterior lobe, its main function is for coordination. The archicerebellum, or also known as your flocculonodular lobe, which is responsible for equilibrium. The paleocerebellum, or also known as the anterior lobe, its main function is to control the muscle tone. And the last part of the brainstem, medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata has its nucleus, which is responsible for swallowing. And that nucleus is your nucleus of ambiguous. Attachment of cranial nerve number 9, which is your glossopharyngeal nerve, and cranial nerve number 10, or also known as vagus nerve. It is also the center for respiration regulator. The dorsal respiration group at the medulla controls the normal quiet respiration, and the ventral respiration group of the medulla is responsible for forceful inspiration. And in your medulla, you have the primitive reflexes. And those are the STNR, or also known as symmetrical tonic neck reflex, ATNR, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, the TLR, or also known as your tonic lumbar reflex, and your supporting reaction. Then the last part of the anatomy is the blood supply of the brain. The anterior circulation comes from the common carotid artery, while the posterior circulation comes from the vertebral artery. Then you have your circle of Willis. This picture here is the inferior view. So your circle of Willis involves one communicating The circle of Willis involves one anterior communicating artery, two anterior cerebral artery, two internal carotid artery, two posterior communicating artery, and two posterior cerebral artery. So this part here is only your circle of Willis. The rest are not included. And also remember that MCA is not part of the circle of Willis. And that's end the part 1.